Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. So, about my philosophy, one thing I'll say is I call myself an objectivist, not a libertarian. A lot of people who come across me think of me as a libertarian and label me that sometimes. So let me just say a couple things about why I use the term objectivist instead. First of all, objectivism is an entire philosophy. It's not just a political philosophy. So it encompasses views in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, as well as politics, aesthetics as well. It has distinctive views there. So it's not just a political philosophy, it's an entire worldview. Another key distinguishing characteristic is it's not an anarchist political philosophy. A lot of people who call themselves libertarians endorse some form of anarchy. I think sometimes they call themselves anarcho-capitalists, which I think might be a contradiction in terms. So I want to clearly distinguish myself from those sorts of people. Now, some people who use the term libertarian may use it in a way that is consistent with a government, but just to keep it clear or eliminate confusion, and for accuracy, I think objectivist is the best term for my view. So there's a little about why. I do. I also have a PhD in philosophy and a master's in philosophy. Yeah. Very few. I think there are some that have existed. There are some objectivist professors, for instance, Tara Smith at the University of Texas at Austin. There was Alan Gotthelf, who taught at the College of New Jersey and the University of Pittsburgh, Jim Lennox, Daryl Wright. So there were some objectivist professors scattered here and there, but they're definitely by far the minority. As for how I came across it, it was before I entered university, actually right after I finished high school. My brother had recommended I read Ayn Rand, and I checked her books out right after I finished high school, that summer between high school and college, and that's when I started reading her. So it wasn't through university that I got to know her; it was just on my own. But I loved her ideas. I was just blown away by them, and I thought they made a lot of sense. So I just continued to study them. In large part on my own, although I have also taken courses through the Ayn Rand Institute, which is a separate think tank, not affiliated with the university, but they offer courses in her philosophy. So I took many years of courses there, and I continue to study the philosophy on my own.
Okay, we have a technical issue. I may have just fixed it. Now, chat, they can't hear me apparently. So I just changed something in OBS. Can someone in chat tell me if it's working now? Because this will be kind of a waste of a debate if no one can hear me. Okay, it should. Something looks like it's working on my screen. Okay, thank God. Okay, we're good. They can hear me. Sorry, I didn't really catch all of that because I was so worried about the audio here.
That's all right.
Okay,
we can repeat any of that you want to.
I mean, they heard you fine.
Okay.
It's just that I was a little distracted. Okay, so. Sorry, can you just remind me where you were introduced to it? Now, was it in university or was it outside?
It was outside university right before I started university. So that summer in between high school and college is when I first read Ayn Rand. My brother had recommended it to me, so I read it on his recommendation. And I loved it. I continued studying it largely on my own, although I also had taken classes at the Ayn Rand Institute in her philosophy.
Oh, wow. Okay. What's the Ayn Rand Institute?
It's a think tank. It was started in 1985, a few years after Ayn Rand died. And its mission is to advance her philosophy, spread awareness and understanding of it. And they have a variety of programs which they use to do that. They have an essay contest, international essay contest on her books. So there's cash prizes for kids who around the world who want to read her books, write an essay on it, and maybe win some money. And they've got college campus clubs around the world. They've got they have media outreach that they do, and they also offer courses, some of which I took, and they do other things as well. But those are some of their core activities.
Okay, so this was like right before you, in between high school and university, that you came to read some Ayn Rand and get into it, recommended by your brother. What, okay, what drew you to like this whole, philosophy of self-interest and non-aggression principle and kind of capitalism is the ultimate beacon for freedom? What drew you to that?
Well, I thought Ayn Rand's ideas made sense. So I didn't really have any particular viewpoint prior to reading her. I wasn't very aware politically. So in many ways, she was my introduction to the field of politics and economics. And I had some, I guess, some vague understanding of those fields, but I hadn't really thought about them much at all. But when I read her works, I thought they made a lot of sense. They cohered with the observations I had made about the world. To this extent, I had made any by this age. I was relatively young, 17, almost 18. And
what kind of observations were confirmed in the book?
I guess it was maybe more in the ethical realm than in the political, because as I said, I wasn't very aware politically of what was going on, but just ethically, she makes this case that egoism is good and that altruism, or self-sacrifice, is bad and is doing a lot of damage to the world. And so I guess one thing that I had a sense of is that altruism was sort of a dominant moral viewpoint that a lot of people, if they didn't follow it, they'd at least pay lip service to it. Mm-hmm. And they held it up as some kind of moral ideal. And if, a good person is considered like Mother Teresa, someone who's living their lives for the sake of others. And I remember on my college applications, I think one of the questions on one of the schools I applied to said, like, well, who are the people you admire and look up to, or like, who are your heroes, or something like that. And I think I actually included Mother Teresa as one of the people. No, I've heard some of his videos, but I haven't actually read him.
Have you heard about what he thinks about Mother Teresa?
I think I might have heard he had a pretty negative view, but
correct. Yes.
Is that understating it radically?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard some things have come out about her maybe after she died that made her appear quite bad, but I haven't looked into those. But anyways, a lot of what people admire her for, I don't know what the reality of it was, but at least what she kind of symbolized was self-sacrifice and living for the sake of others. And I wasn't raised religiously myself. I was in a pretty secular household, but I think that altruist morality, or this morality of self-sacrifice, still can affect people just in the culture. I think maybe post-Kant, Immanuel Kant, the philosophy of altruism or self-sacrifice has been secularized. And maybe I just picked that up to some extent from the culture. So even if you're not a religious person, you can still pick up this religious in origin morality of self-sacrifice. And I think I did that to some extent.
Are you religious?
And no, I didn't believe in a God growing up. I never went to church. My family didn't really speak about it. So I wasn't religious in any overt obvious way, but I think I still picked up from the culture this religious morality. I think Christianity has had a huge influence on the culture. So even if you're not raised in a religious household, you still get exposed to it somehow. I think the ideas of Christianity, of altruism, of self-sacrifice, are still around in the culture. Don't be selfish. Pretty much everyone hears something like that. It's better to be selfless. Give back. These kinds of things you hear, whether or not you're religious, so you can still pick up this sort of morality. And I think I was not hugely influenced by that, but to some degree, I think I was. And I thought Ayn Rand gave a good analysis of that and how there's not really any good reason to accept it. So I don't know if that answered your question. You asked like, what in her works did I find confirming? But I think one of the, I guess, just to put it more briefly, is her identification of the prevalence of altruism was one thing that I thought that resonated with me. It seemed plausible. And then her arguments against it, which I hadn't really heard because I think those are much less known in the culture. I thought her arguments against it made sense, and her arguments for egoism made sense. But also her arguments for other things too, like capitalism. But I guess in my own experience, I was more attuned to the ethical issues because I just wasn't very aware politically in those young years. But definitely the ethics resonated with me, and I thought she was also very logical in the way she thinks about things and writes about things. So I liked her way of thinking, and I think that impacts everything she touches. Whether it's ethics or politics or aesthetics. I liked her way of approaching issues.
So where do you think altruism comes from? If this is some kind of evil or thing we don't want to have or don't want to emphasize.
So first of all, I think it's just we should be clear on what altruism means, or at least how she is understanding it. So she understands it as self-sacrifice, in other words, or putting others' interest ahead of your own interests. So it's not just being kind towards other people or being benevolent towards other people. I think those are perfectly compatible with egoism. It's actually in your own interest, I think, to be kind and benevolent towards other people, to respect other people's rights. If you're a jerk to other people, they're not going to want to be your friend. They're not going to want to be your romantic partner, for instance. So I think it's in your interest to be to treat others well. That's not what altruism means, at least as she understands it. She understands it as sacrificing your own interests for the sake of others, putting others' interests ahead of your own. So, for instance, if you have a child and your neighbor also has a child, and you have a choice, am I going to spend my money on my own child or the neighbor's child? And say you only have enough money to buy food for one of them. Well, the really moral thing to do, if you're an altruist and you believe in the morality of self-sacrifice, is to give up what's personally valuable to you, which is, let's say, your own child, and then support the other child. Support, something that's not a direct benefit to you. That would be selfish. The self-sacrificial thing is to help the other child. Now, that would be an instance of altruism as Ayn Rand is understanding it. And that's what she rejects. She thinks there's no reason to put others' interests ahead of your own. There's every reason to put your own interests first. That doesn't mean violating the rights of others. She thinks you should respect the rights of others, but you should do so because it's in your own interest to do so. I just had a talk with another person. I think the latest video on my YouTube channel, it has a large section about why, or I was debating this person. Last username is the guy's name, on why or whether it's in your own interest to respect other people's rights. So there's a long
Mm-hmm.
discussion of that in my latest video on my YouTube channel, which if I can put in a quick plug just to let people know what it is, if they want to check it out, youtube.com/Dan Norton 1. You can find it that way. Or you can search for the Selfishness Project. I have a lot of videos on my channel about the topic of selfishness. So if you put in Selfishness Project in the search engine, that's an easy way to find my YouTube channel.
Okay.
So I have gone on for a while here, but I don't want to ramble. You had asked about altruism, and I forget your original question. I don't know if you want to go back to that or go in
I
another
asked
direction.
where does altruism come from?
Oh, where does it come from? I was just saying that what it is, first of all. Now, where does it come from? So what it is in Ayn Rand's view, is placing others' interests ahead of your own. Where does it come from? I think it might come from uh, mysticism. I think it was used by, uh, at least this is a plausible story. I have another video about this, as a tool of exploitation. So if you can convince people that the moral thing to do, at least in this life, is to put others' interest ahead of your own, and if you can sell them on the idea or the myth that there's an afterlife in which you will be rewarded, then you might be able to get them to sacrifice themselves, at least in this life. In a way, you're still appealing to their self-interest, because you're telling them, in the next life, you'll get 72 virgins, or you'll, have you'll be in eternal bliss in heaven. Um, but if you can convince people that, in this life, the good thing to do is to sacrifice themselves, maybe bring offerings to the temple, or give up your firstborn son, or whatever, sacrifice your best goats. Then, the people who convince you of this can basically live as a parasite on you. So if you're a temple priest, you're receiving all the offerings that people bring to the temple. You receive their sacrificial offerings. Well, now you don't have to do any work. You can just live off the work of others and raising their goats or their wheat or whatever they bring, whatever their sacrificial offering is. And you don't have to do any work. So I think that could explain what gave rise to this altruist, self-sacrificial sort of morality. Some people trying to take advantage of others, exploit them, and then I guess faith, I think, goes hand in hand with this, because there really is no logical, rational reason that someone should do this. So you have to resort to mysticism and convince someone that there's some kind of supernatural afterlife that they will somehow end up in and benefit in. You just have to take it on faith, right? That's why I think a lot of religions, faith is essential to them, because there is no rational reason to do the things they tell you to do, to sacrifice yourself. But if you can get someone to throw off their minds, to abandon their reason, then you can get them to do all kinds of things they wouldn't otherwise do. So I think that's at least part of significant, maybe the main part of how I would explain, why something like altruism, in the sense of self-sacrifice, came to be.
Okay, so let me start by agreeing with you. As a Marxist, actually, I I very much agree that you should put your own interests as and it only makes sense to put your own interests as a working class person first, because you damn well know that the ruling class, the capitalists, are going to put their own interests at first, and they are not your interest. At least that's what I argue. So yeah, you definitely want to do that, and even on the personal level, like your example before, I agree with you there, where you said if you have a choice between feeding yourself and feeding your neighbor's kids or whatever it is. I actually have that exact example has come up in my own life. I have a friend who is basically doing that and is like funding other people that she's not responsible for. And I'm like, it frustrates me a lot. I try to, you'd think a socialist might not argue that, but I was very much trying to get her to put her own interest in her own life ahead of, and that, if she really wants to help these people out, there's better ways to do it than just throwing your money away and making yourself putting yourself in a worse position. And yeah, I agree that altruism, putting uh, the kind of sacrificing yourself for the group is very handy for cults, especially for religion, um, and but you can also, there's also a way to think about. I mean, I think that the binary between altruism and selfishness is a very kind of, it's not a very strong one, um, or at least it's not a very enlightening one. From my perspective, it doesn't tell you much about society, and I don't think it really helps us plan a good society. I know Ayn Rand feels differently. You mentioned that you hear people say don't be selfish, and that's true. But like I asked you where that comes from, and you gave an answer. But I think there's kind of more material roots at hand. I don't know how familiar you are with anthropology, like human anthropology, um, but I mean even primitive societies today like display, I wouldn't call it altruism, but they very much, it's in their interest, or they find it in their interest to share everything they get. This is because resources are scarce, and the moment you start having somebody become selfish or hoard the scarce amount of resources, that becomes a threat to the entire tribe. And humans are, we're smart, but we're vulnerable, weak animals. We don't do well on our own, and we're social creatures. Which, and the funny thing about that is, around each other, sharing and sacrifice. Maybe not sacrifice, but anytime you have something, let's say you made a kill, you will try your hardest to not brag about it, and you'll share with everybody else. But if you let's say you're out in the forest and you find a gold mine of berries by yourself, well, you're going to share those with your tribe, but those people are actually more likely than us in capitalist society to steal more for themselves, because they're so used to being in a society where all they do is share and give to others and help the community, that when they get the opportunity to be selfish, they actually take more advantage of it than us, because in our society we're competitive with each other. We're very individualistic. That's just the nature of bourgeois capitalist society. And so when we get the opportunity to sacrifice or to give to others, we're actually a bit more giving because we're not used to doing it as much. So my point is really that there's material roots to these behaviors, what you call altruism and or selfishness. So like, of course, it's all humans have the capacity for both, right? It's not one or the other. And society really wouldn't make, or human society wouldn't have gotten anywhere, wouldn't have evolved to where it is if it didn't have the capacity for both. If we didn't work together, we would have got nowhere. Everything, even in hyper capitalistic society with limited government, nothing would get done without people working together, right? Building houses, materials shipped from all across the world, food distribution, like things don't work unless we do them together in an organized way. So we are social in that aspect. That doesn't necessarily mean we are actually sacrificing, though, or being altruistic, because all these things are actually in our interest. And the last thing I'll say is, you mentioned, how religion uses altruism and so the sacrifice of the self for a greater good after life, and basically end up with people accepting their own kind of slavery in a feudal system or whatever. Well, I would argue the same thing applied to capitalism, because the justifying ideology for capitalism for a long time in England, where it started, and I believe Netherlands, because they were both Protestant, was the Protestant work ethic, which Max Weber outlined famously, and that was kind of the whole. The church was pushing this idea of work is good, and this is something that so people working 12, 14-hour shifts in the factories were internalizing, and so that it would pacify them. And this is something capitalism very much took advantage of and promoted for its own benefit in order to grow. And I mean, we haven't gotten into capitalism yet, but I'll just let you respond to that.
Okay. Let's see. So the issue of selfishness, like the issue of altruism, is one I think we should be clear on what's meant by that. So just as altruism, as Rand understands it, doesn't mean just being kind or benevolent to others. So selfishness doesn't mean what people often take it to mean, which is violating others' rights, being a jerk,
Not necessarily.
Treating people unfairly. All of these things are actually not in your self-interest. So what she takes selfishness to mean is simply being concerned with your own interests. And she thinks you're actually harming your own interests if you are a jerk to others, if you violate others' rights, as I mentioned before, and I gave some examples of that. So that's one point. Now, you mentioned the thing about sharing, like in a tribe, if you might share berries or something if you find them. Now, so in her sense, that's of these terms, that's not necessarily an altruistic, unselfish thing to do. That could be sharing, could be a selfish thing to do in her sense, because it could be in your own interest to be part of a tribe that's flourishing. Because if you don't help your fellow tribesmen to do well, and they end up dying, and then you're left all alone, then you have fewer people to help you out in tough times. And that's just one example. So it's not necessarily altruistic to share the berries. It could be selfish to do that. Okay. And now on capitalism, so that's come up now. That's another term which the meaning of it, I think, needs to be made clear, because I think it's often distorted in strawmans. For instance, today, I would say we are definitely not a capitalist society. We're far from a capitalist society. We have tremendous amount of taxation and regulations. There's a Federal Reserve System that can create fiat money. There's all kinds of things that the government does that it would not be doing in a capitalist society. All these, retirement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education, public roads, public mail carrying, postal service, all these things funded by coercive taxation. None of this would exist in a capitalist.
Let me just stop you right there. Did
okay.
Was it you who talked to Sam Cedar about taxation and whether taxes are theft or not, or was that someone else?
I did talk to Sam Cedar about whether, about the meaning of coercion, and I think it also maybe first came up in regard to taxation. I was saying in one of my calls to Sam Cedar, these are linked on my YouTube channel, by the way. I said taxes are coercive, and I think his co-host Emma was saying, well, there's no way to avoid coercion. You're coerced to work a job. She said that, and I said no, it's voluntary. So we had disagreements about what is and isn't coercive over the course of actually a couple calls to Sam Cedar about that. And I think that's another term, just like capitalism, which I think there's going to be disagreements between people who are socialists, people who are capitalists. They're not going to agree on what is and isn't coercion. So I think it's very important to get clear on what all these terms mean. And if we're not using them in the same sense, then we're just talking past each other. And that's not going to make for a very productive discussion. So we could talk about some of these concepts, and if you have a different view of what capitalism is or what coercion is, then that's something I'd be game to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, because the meat of what I wanted to talk about was capitalism, and in general, I mean, capitalism for you is a vehicle to reach ultimate human freedom, like for the individual, right? So that's why you prefer capitalism. So, so we'll talk about capitalism in a second. But what I wanted to bring up was, did I just forget what I wanted to bring up? What were you saying right before that?
Uh, I was, well, I had gone through the meaning of selfishness as Rand understands it, and said how that's, uh, it could be selfish in her sense to share the berries. And then I said capitalism is another term that she has, or the way she understands it, it's definitely not the system we have today. We don't have anything close to a capitalist system. She would call it a mixed economy, what we have today. There's a mixture of freedom and controls. There's much the government does in terms of taxes and regulations, which it would not be doing in a capitalist society as she understands it. So in her view, the only thing the government would be doing in a capitalist society is protecting individual rights, which for her means protecting people from physical force or coercion, to use that term. So there's only basically three functions of a proper government: police, military, and courts. So the police, it protects you from domestic criminals who would use force against you. And the military protects you from foreign invaders who would use force against you. And then the courts settles disputes peacefully between people so that, they don't have to resort to physical force to settle their dispute. They can settle it in a peaceful way. So those are the only things that the government should be doing in a capitalist society.
That always seemed a bit hypocritical, or maybe contradictory to me from a libertarian perspective, because like the military and the police are the most coercive elements of the state. They're the most coercive things you can have. And in fact, in practice, all through history, what happens with militaries, especially from large empires like the United States? Well, they invade, they overthrow, they coup governments that don't toe the line that they want them to, that don't play along, that don't help American capitalism. And what do the police do? Well, we all got to see, thanks to cell phones, what happens to when people protest with the George Floyd protests 2 summers ago. Police were beating the crap out of elderly men, out of people doing nothing at all. We got to see a taste of why they exist, and what they're for. So, I mean, again, it seems pretty clear. Like, how do you explain that what militaries have been shown to do and what they're for, and same with police, and how do you see that? How can you square that with like this idea that they're there to protect, liberty?
Well, I think that's their proper function, which is not to say they can't
That's not
be abused.
Do you know the history of police? Do you know why they exist? That was never their proper function.
I'm saying this is what they should do. They shouldn't use force in initiation. They should only use force in retaliation. If they don't do that, then they become the criminals that they're supposed to protect us from.
So how do you create a society? Like, do you just change people's minds, the ideas in their head, and say, well, tell police, it's better if you just aren't brutalizing the poor and minorities, and you like, do you think that's going to be persuasive?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, we might have different evaluations of to what extent right now the police are initiating force,
How about
as
in Chile?
opposed
They
to
were shooting people in the eye for protesting? Or how about in
as
Russia?
opposed to retaliating in force. Like, I mean, just take the American police in general. I'm no expert on this, but in general, I think they do use force in retaliation. They don't. They're catching crooks. They're stopping criminals. Now there are some crimes like drug crimes. I don't think they should be going after. I think this is one of the problems, that we've made some things, some activities criminal, which shouldn't be criminal, namely using drugs. I think drugs should be legalized.
Why have we done
Prostitution,
that?
I think, should be
Why do you
legalized.
think the state did that?
But I think, just to finish the thought here, I think in general, the at least in the United States, we don't have like a Gestapo, right? A secret police which is going around arresting people without any warrants in the middle of the night, hauling them off to jail without a trial. We have a legal system here, and
We sort of do.
not perfect, but I think in general, our police do use force in retaliation. They might screw up sometimes, but I think in general they are doing that.
You don't think there's a history?
So that's what I would say.
You don't think that there's a history of, people inconvenient to the state getting offed before their trials, or or before releasing some piece of journalism, or before speaking out? I'm thinking several people around 9/11, several people around the JFK assassination, several people around the 2000 election. You don't think this is the type of thing that happens at all? I mean, there's examples.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all. I'm just saying I don't think that's the dominant trend. I think it's probably, I mean, I haven't looked into it much, but I would guess that it's a quite small percentage of, if you consider all the police interactions, the millions, I don't know how many there are per year, I would suspect the vast majority of them are going pretty much as they should. And, you hear about the ones that don't go as they should precisely because, I would think, because they are exceptions. I mean, if that were the rule, then, it wouldn't make the news. It wouldn't be any big deal. It would just be the norm. But I think the norm is pretty good.
Okay, well,
but I mean, I think there is certain laws are bad and have been around for a long time, like these drug laws. I think they're very bad. I think that's actually making things worse. It's harder for the police to catch the actual criminals when they spend so much time and resources going after these people who are not committing any crime that's hurting anybody, except maybe themselves. I mean, I don't think it's good to be addicted to drugs, but I think someone should have the freedom to use drugs, and it's not right for the police to prosecute them. It's a victimless crime, so it shouldn't be a crime. It should only be a crime, I think, if you're initiating force against somebody else.
Okay, but I mean, if you hold up capitalism as the system that's going to bring the most freedom, it is under capitalism, and because of capitalism, that states do things like criminalize drugs, because that helps to keep a certain population as the underclass, and that allows you to have a reserve army of labor to keep wages low, because when you have a working class that's, let's say their wages are getting too high for the average capitalist. Well, if you have a large unemployed and lumpenized amount of, let's say, black people or whoever, or poor whites, that is a threat to the people who are working class, and so their wages can be crushed down, because if you fire those people, then you have a reserve army of labor to take the place of those people, and to take those jobs. And so keeping a boot on the neck of a certain percentage of the population is always going to be helpful for a capitalist system.
Okay, so here again, we come to the issue of the meaning of terms. So the way you're using capitalism is not the way I would use it, because these things you're describing are not capitalist activities. So there are no laws under capitalism that criminalize drugs. So the only laws there are laws that bar the initiation of force, and that includes fraud. That's also outlawed. That's a form of force, I think. But you're not initiating force against anybody when you use drugs. You might be hurting yourself, but you're not using force against anybody else. So that will not be criminalized under a capitalist system, as I'm using the term capitalism.
But we're in capitalism now.
No.
It is criminal.
So here again, we disagree. So this is why I think it's really important to get clear on the terms, because, if you call today's system capitalism, then, yes, we're using the word in totally different senses, because it has no relation to the way I'm using it. Okay. So, we're just talking past each other at that point.
Okay. Well, then let's take, this is kind of what I wanted to get into. Let's take the libertarian kind of ideal fantasy version of capitalism, right? So it's a little hard to do because you kind of have to root it in history. Where did capitalism come from? Well, capitalism is, we all through history there has been commodity production. That's all. It's always existed. People have grown or made things for the purpose of sale. That's what a commodity is. So instead of you make things for the purpose of use for yourself or for others, you make it for the purpose of sale. That's what a commodity. So capitalism is the generalization of commodity production as the mode of production. So of how things get produced and how things get consumed. So that happens because what was formerly commonly owned land, the commons, gets privatized, gets enclosed in England, in France, in all of Europe, basically. And so the enclosure movement starts a process of big landholders taking over and kicking peasants off the land. Peasants have to go. Now they have no way of sustaining themselves, and they have to go to the cities where factories now exist. And so capitalist production is when you own the means of production. Let's say privately owned, you own a factory or something, and you're making widgets, and you need people to work for you. But in a society where previously everyone was self-sustaining, or in communities, and made their own food, which for almost 99.9% of human history, that's how the world worked. Most people live that way. You couldn't really get capitalism off the ground, because you had no one to. Why would anybody work for you in 12 hours a day in a factory? Well, once you kick them off the land and enclose the commons, then you're able to do that, because people have nowhere else to go. So capitalism itself is the theft of the commons to start with, right? And then that enables capital to start. Oh, and colonialism, obviously. So right. So the by force, raping and pillaging and bringing back of wealth from the New World to the Old World brings the extra wealth needed to actually get industry going, and so you end up so early on in the 1800s, 1840s, maybe before that. Then you have a system that is what you might call pure capitalism, where there's not much government regulation of anything going on. In fact, modern states, for the most part, don't really exist. And you have businesses that are highly competitive with each other. But soon that, as Marx explained, that gives way to monopoly capitalism, right? Because once one capitalist is more successful than another, or has some advantage for whatever reason, he's going to grow bigger and buy out the other guy. Because capitalism is so productive, this happens faster and faster. So you end up with monopolies, then cartels, and then finally you end up with imperialism, because it starts being more profitable to export your production elsewhere. And so the whole thing is predicated on theft and violence. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. It's actually a very progressive thing in the course of human history. Capitalism unleashed an insane amount of productivity. So that's a very good thing. However, to do that, it was a very bloody and brutal process. Now, the state comes into play as capitalism, as the states start to realize they need to kind of manage and help capitalism grow. They grow alongside capitalism. So you could the modern state exists because of the commodity production and state itself. So you can't separate the two. They're inextricably intertwined, because without a state, you don't have you used to have like tariffs and stuff, and different you use different coins in different provinces and stuff. You need to make trade easy. You need to facilitate it. In a way that you can't do without a state and the standardization of rules and laws that make and enforce property rights. And so the size of the state directly correlates to the size of the market. Ministries and departments merge to facilitate capitalist growth, not to stop it. Without the state, there is no capitalism. The reason Das Kapital by Marx is so important is that Marx takes libertarians at their word. He lays out the capitalist mode of production under the perfect competitive conditions that you guys outline or at least assume, and then shows concretely how its inherent contradictions not only lead to its own abolition, but to socialism. And yeah, the point I wanted to make earlier is that you say that if sharing is in your own interest, because we talked about primitive societies. If sharing is in your own interest sometimes, then why I'm not sure why her conclusion isn't that you have to go to socialism, because in order to actually maximize the efficiency and wealth of society, and get rid of all the waste and make as much people as live in the most high standard society as possible, you'd want to share these things communally and raise everybody's level instead of and there's no force necessary there, because it's democratically controlled by the workers who were brought together by the system, right? Like I said, from the reason you couldn't have socialism hundreds of years ago is because everyone lived out on in the countryside. When capitalism brings everyone together into the cities, kicks them off the land, brings them together, suddenly these workers can realize they share the same interest. There's only one boss, and they actually have the power in the situation, and they can just take over the factories that the boss owns and run society themselves. Sorry, that was a lot there.
Yeah, that was a lot. So we're still not using the term in the same sense, because when you talk about theft, kicking people off the lands,
yeah, that's a prerequisite for capitalist society.
No, I don't think it is. I think so. What I endorse and what I understand capitalism to be is a system in which you respect individual rights. And what that means is that you don't initiate force. You don't kick people off their land. You don't engage in thievery. So if that is involved, that is not capitalism, or at least that's not what I endorse, and it's not what Ayn Rand endorses. It's something else.
Then how did capitalism evolve out of feudal societies, previous societies? How did it happen that all of a sudden there was privately owned means of production and wage labor, right? And surplus value. How did that happen? Just because everyone agreed, just thought about it and had a debate?
Well, there was, a lot of the key knowledge, I think, was discovered by John Locke, and following on his discovery of rights, which I don't think he had a perfect grasp of, but I think it was a huge leap forward. The founding fathers implemented his idea of rights in a political system, and their ideas are expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Not perfectly, but it was a huge leap forward from what existed prior to that. So I think the Locke's and the founding fathers' idea of rights is, I think, essentially this idea of uh, not initiating force. They didn't say that explicitly, I don't believe, but I think that's the implied idea of like the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Um, I think maybe in some other documents or drafts of those documents, they refer to the right to property. Uh, so, as to how this came about historically, I think in the Enlightenments and in the Age of Reason, figures like Locke and the founding fathers came up with this idea that the role of the state, it shouldn't be the role of the state to dictate to people how they live their lives. The state should be the servant of people, not the master of the people. So there was no king in America. That was a new kind of idea. It's no longer your idea to live for the glory of some monarch. Rather, the individual's life is paramount. That's what really matters. And the role of the state and the government is to help the individual live a good life. And they tried to create a new kind of political system with the individual in mind, not with some absolute monarch and who's just got serfs serving him. That's not the right role of the individual. The individual is an end in himself. He's not just sacrificial fodder for some tribe or some king. He has the right to his own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that's so. Once these ideas were discovered, then they created a constitution to try to implement that. And there were contradictions from the start. They still had slavery, which was a violation of rights. And then they fought a civil war to end that, to more consistently carry out the principle that was implicit in the founding documents. They granted everyone the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think in the late 19th century may have been the time when it was closest to what I'm talking about, or what Rand had envisioned for an ideal society, where no one is initiating force against anyone else. And the state's role is just to protect individual rights. And then I think that's been eroded in the 20th century with the rise of the welfare states and all these government programs, Social Security, Medicare. I think we've lost the vision of the founders and are moving away from that back in a more statist kind of direction.
Okay, so initiating force. You said that was part of the goals of the founding fathers. Now,
well, that's what they tried to oppose.
That's right. So, but from day one, in the United States, they landed there and started implementing the private property system from the UK, from Britain, and that meant necessarily taking, fencing off, putting lines around some land. And who were they taking that away from? That didn't come from, that just wasn't theirs, just because they happened to be there. That it was used by Indians, is what they called them at the time. And through the century, they started just pushing more and more westward, kicking Native Americans off the land in order to facilitate this private property. So I would say that's force. I would say anytime you take what was once public land and saying this is mine now, that is absolutely force and coercion. And saying you can't come in here, this is mine.
So the Indians is, yeah, that's often brought up. Didn't we steal land from the Indians? In some cases, we might have, but
definitely did.
In some cases, we might not have. So I don't think that if you're there's a question of what gives you the right to land. I mean, if you land on a continent and there's Jamestown, and you find a little island, and there's no one there. At least not in the day you landed. Let's say. I mean, do you have a right to take that land over? What if some Indian comes by once every 300 years to shoot a buffalo with a bow and arrow? Does he have now a right to that entire island because maybe once every 300 years he's going to come by and shoot an animal? I don't think it's obvious that he does. So I think we need to come up with a system of property rights and try to figure out, well, what is it that entitles you to some land? Did the Indians have a right to the entire continents? And so does that mean that, no one could have ever come here? Did the Indians themselves even have a concept of rights? Did the Indians engage in millennia of tribal warfare where they slaughtered each other? If so, then
Europeans did that too.
Did they really have any greater claim than anybody else to the lands? Or should we be attacking the Indians for being savages given the way they treated each other? I think these are relevant questions. So I don't think it's obvious that we can just take for granted that what the Europeans did was entirely wrong and was stealing land. Maybe in some cases it was. Now, I think if Indians were being peaceful, if they weren't engaging in massacres unprovoked, then I don't think it's right to attack the Indians. I think if they're just engaging in agriculture on some set of land, I don't think any Europeans have a right to kick them off that land or to steal what they've taken. I think they can trade. They can at least offer to engage in trade with those Indians, but I don't think they have a right to kick them off that land. If they did kick them off that land, then I think that's a violation of their rights, and that shouldn't have been done.
Okay. So I mean, you acknowledge that perhaps some of the at least some of the land seizures may not have been done without coercion. Now, I mean, I'm sure you've seen a map before of Native American reservations in the United States now, and what that looks like. I'm sure you can imagine if you just look at a map, it's about 99% owned by the colonists currently now, and the Native Americans are left with tiny little parcels scattered around the mid and western United States. In fact, the East is almost entirely they wiped out. They got pushed out. Now, from what you were describing, most of what was done was justified for some reason, or maybe through deals or whatever. I can't imagine 20 million Native Americans agreeing without coercion to how this map looks now, right? If you think back in 1776, or no, sorry, not 1776, in the 1600s or whatever, when they first encountered the Jamestowners, they said, okay, here's the deal we're going to give you. We're going to take 99% of your land, and you can have these little patches in the west, and you have to move, by the way. You can't live here anymore. You think is that something they would have agreed to without force? I don't think so.
Well, there's a lot of Indian groups. I mean, they're not a monolithic tribe, and they fought amongst themselves.
So they're saying they're wiped themselves out all of a sudden in 100 years.
I think some of them did try to exterminate other tribes, actually. So
that explains why they don't have any land anymore.
No, I'm just saying that they're not a monolithic group. It's not like there was one nice group of Indians who were totally peaceful, and we just kicked them all to some tiny remote place in the West. There are lots of different tribes, and they fought amongst themselves. And I mean, they would ally. Some would ally with the French, some would ally with the British, and they would kill each other in the wars that European countries were fighting in the French and Indian Wars. And all these treaties were made, many different treaties with many different groups.
How many of those treaties
Um,
were respected by the French and the British?
I don't know.
Not
I don't
many.
know like all the history of this, but I'm just saying there's no, I don't think there's one simple answer that says, we just kicked the Indians off their lands into this one tiny place and it was unjustified. I think it's more complicated than that. Which is not to say there weren't unjust things done. But I think if there, insofar as there were unjust things done, insofar as there were initiations of force, I oppose that. I don't think it should have been done.
Okay, but
You could have asked them, to assimilate, or if they don't want to assimilate, they can be on some plot of lands and maybe trade if they want. But I don't think they should be kicked off it if they're being peaceful.
if they're being so okay, so um, yeah, if they're being peaceful. Shoot, I had something to say. Okay, so I think the difference here is you see capitalism as an ethical system from the outset, like inherently ethical, that it helps promote freedom. What I'm trying to explain to you is that capitalism emerges materially out of history, and it emerges a certain way. You can't do it without blood and theft and without expropriation. Um, there's no version of capitalism that can come about any other way. If you have societies, as they all were, with 90% of the population living off the land, and you need to get industry going, and you need you're trying to get the private property system going. At some point, you have to make a change materially, and that's going to be to kick people off the land, and that's going to be also to go to the New World and get extract resources and send them back. Now, so like there is no modern United States or Britain without the colonies, because that's where the wealth, all that extra wealth came from, in order to get industry going, to get the factories off the ground, and the railroads and the steam and the mills. It can't really happen otherwise. You can't raise enough capital or generate enough wealth without having done that colonization and invasions and violence to begin with. And capitalism, like, you seem to, I think, yeah, you have kind of a divorced from the material world idea of what, like, capitalism is an idea. It's a mode of production. It's a way people organize society. Oh shoot, I'll fix that. Here, I'll let you respond.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't accept that capitalism has as part of it that you have to invade other people's lands and engage in theft. I think that's, I don't
But it
see
happened every
any
single
reason for
time.
that.
It happened at everywhere capitalism emerged early. That's what happened.
The I mean, there's the fact that there was some instances of theft, which I'll grant, doesn't mean that it had to happen or that wouldn't have been better. I think it would have been better if there weren't. It could have had even a stronger system, if they had respected rights all along. I think you get more value that way, more trading partners. If you're not conquering people, instead you're treating them as respected equals, and you can trade with them. They'll be much better disposed towards you. It's in your interest. to respect people's rights.
Okay, so why is socialism not in? Uh, uh, so capitalism, by definition, creates classes, right? You have owners of capital, privately held means of production, then you have workers for them. So you automatically get a class differentiation. There's people in the middle. There's petty bourgeoisie. There's middle class people. There's lumpen. How does capitalism for you generate freedom?
Well, it doesn't generate freedom; it is freedom, but like by definition,
If
as
you're
I
hold on,
understand it.
if you're somebody, if you're born property less, and you can't eat or have shelter without selling your labor power to someone else who has basically control over your life, then how is that not freedom? How is that freedom? You don't have the freedom to not do
Okay,
that. You have to sell yourself to some capitalist in that situation.
so I think now we might be getting to a more fundamental concept than capitalism, namely freedom. So, what does freedom mean? Uh, and the way I understand freedom in this context, in a political context, is the absence of force or coercion. So I think that's even a more fundamental concept. So we're defining, or I'm defining, freedom in terms of force. It's the absence of force. That's what freedom is.
Okay.
And then that raises a question of what is force, or what is coercion, and we could talk about that. And I have some videos about that. That was one of the main topics of my calls to Sam Cedar. So I think often that's where the disagreement is between socialists and capitalists, is what is actually coercion or what is force.
But don't you think that's kind of a narrow, like, stunted view of freedom? Like that by your definition, someone living on the streets as a homeless person is free, right? They're the most free because no one's telling them what to do. Like, but and yet their options, their what's on the horizon for their possibilities is the lowest um, out of anyone in modern society. So I mean, that's not a very that doesn't seem to me like a very good notion of freedom, very useful one. Because why don't we just all be homeless then? So we're all free and not have jobs.
Well, I wouldn't say that a homeless person is most free. I
Well,
don't think freedom
they're
is.
not. They don't have coercion. No one's coercing them.
They might be free, but I wouldn't say they're the most free. So if they're not subject to coercion, then I would say they are free. But many other people are also not subject to coercion who are not living on the streets. I don't think you're any like have a special amount of freedom just because you're on the streets. I think what matters is, are you being subject to force by somebody else? If you're not, you're free. Doesn't mean you're doing great, but it does mean you're free. So I think freedom is a necessary condition of having a good life, but it's not a sufficient condition. I think to have a good life, you need to use your freedom wisely. You have to not be a lazy bum. You should try to find some productive work to support yourself. And if you choose not to do that, if you choose to be a bum on the streets and just panhandle for money, I don't think that's going to be conducive to a happy life. So I think that would be a bad use of freedom. But I think some people might choose that.
So you think homeless people choose to be homeless people?
I think
Have you met homeless people?
some. I think some probably do. I mean, I haven't talked to a lot of them. Um, not. I don't know if I've talked to any of them, but I think people don't. People are responsible for themselves, and I think it's very hard to just end up on the streets without a lot and thousands of choices across the course of many years of your life, which put you there.
Now,
So,
okay, so Marxists like talking about material conditions. So if let's say you are born with, you could be born, maybe you have some mental, No, you're not born with the disease. You're born to a poor and a violent family, abusive family. They abuse each other. They abuse you. You end up developing psychosis, maybe borderline personality disorder, maybe several other things. You can't cope in the world. You start hearing voices. You can't hold a job, and you end up on the streets. Or you because of the way your brain has learned to cope with the trauma it's faced, it becomes addiction seeking. Maybe you get into crack cocaine or heroin or something, because your brain is wired for you to seek this out more than somebody who didn't go through that trauma at a young age. So are we to blame these people for bad choices? Or, because most of the homeless population, I don't know if you can grant me this, are people who they come from deeply troubled families to start with. Oh, Jesus Christ. And usually have very significant mental health issues. So are we just supposed to assume everybody's a perfectly rational actor and has the capability to go be a physicist and just out of decision making, make proper decisions that will make them excel under capitalist society? I'm not so sure.
Well, they might not be able to be a physicist, but I think they can at least rake leaves. I mean, I think it's extremely easy to support yourself. I think there's probably a tiny fringe of people, like well under 1%, who can't do anything at all to support themselves. I think it's extremely easy to support yourself, especially in today's society. If you just, I sometimes give the example of data entry. Like you just have a computer and someone could hire you to do data entry. So even if you're disabled, you're immobile, you don't have any legs even, you can still sit at home and enter data in a computer and get paid to do that.
I had a data entry job, and it required a bachelor's degree.
Well, it doesn't need to.
Which cost me, what, $50,000?
You don't need a bachelor's degree to do data entry. It's a pretty mindless kind of
according to this corporation, I did. According to the market, the free market decided I needed a bachelor's degree.
Well,
and everybody else there had one.
There's no government law saying you have to have a bachelor's degree to do data entry.
The market decided this.
No, I could hire somebody to do data entry if I wanted. That's what do you mean the market decides?
Well,
there's many players in the market. Maybe some people want a bachelor's degree in order to hire someone to do data entry, but certainly not all.
Right, but you also want, if you're hiring a worker, you have a business, you want someone who's going to show up every day, be stable, be of sound mind, and not be unreliable. And if someone has a crack addiction because of the trauma they experienced in their youth, or they just have some schizophrenia or whatever, you're not going to be able to get them to show up. So you're probably not going to bother hiring that person. You're going to find someone who doesn't have many issues, and because they were able to get a bachelor's degree, or they were able to graduate high school, so you can trust that they'll be reliable workers.
Yeah, sure. You should hire reliable workers for sure.
Right. So those people, though, that I was just saying, that living on the streets aren't they have no ability to do that.
There might be a tiny number of people who can't do anything at all, and no one's going to hire them.
So what do we do?
I don't think you. I mean, those people can. I mean, they're at the mercy of charity, and that's.
Charity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty trivial issue because I don't think the way
now.
to
we have charities now, and we have plenty of homeless people. We have people that are unhoused. We have plenty of elderly people that don't get enough care.
Well, we also don't have anything close to capitalism.
How How
in
so?
my view. But of course, that that's the whole. I've talked about how all the
Okay,
taxes and regulations.
how about you tell me, explain what a pure capitalist, a pure form of capitalism looks like.
It would be a system in which the only roles of the governments are police, courts, and military, basically.
Okay, and then so what happens? Uh, so courts are going to enforce contracts between people. I'm assuming.
Or I mean, they help settle disputes in a peaceful way. Instead of
Okay.
people fighting things out if they have a disagreement, they can sue. You can take somebody to court, and then you have objective rules, procedures that you follow, presentations of evidence, counter evidence, cross examination, all that kind of stuff to try to get a fair verdict.
Okay, and who ensures that the courts and the police and the military, who ensures that they don't become corrupted by very successful capitalists who start becoming monopolies and Jesus. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Who ensures they don't be corrupted?
Yeah. How
I
do you
mean,
how do you prevent
there's
those institutions from not from because if you accept that capitalism is free as can be, you let them do their thing, well then you're going to end up with more successful capitalists than others who swallow others up and become monopolies. So and they're going to have the money to try to influence these institutions of the state, the small ones that exist. So how do you prevent that?
well, bribery, basically. So, how do you prevent like rich people from bribing
Yeah,
courts or
sure. Cops.
legislators to well, I think they have to their reputation is on the line. That's one thing. So they have to
The
do this
reputation's on the line now,
covertly. They have to do this covertly because it's illegal in a capitalist system.
but they do that
So,
covertly now,
well,
and it still happens.
I've already said we don't. Are we? I mean, there's always someone who might try. Like, no matter what system you have, people might try to bribe.
Of course they will.
Uh, so, uh, what's what's the best way to minimize that? And I think if you have it as the official law that you can't do such things, which you would have that in a capitalist system, then that means those people have to do it covertly. They have to be secretive. They have to be dishonest about that. They have to do it in the shadows. So they're constantly under threat of getting exposed and blackmail. And I think they might be able to get away with something for a while, but eventually, I think reality is not on their side, and the scandal will come out to light at some point. But I don't know that there's, I mean, that there's a better way to deal with it. I mean, what is the solution? Let people force each other?
No, I
Is it
mean,
should that be the law? Is that going to encourage better behavior?
well, actually,
I don't think so.
I would say the solution is democratic workers' control of the
Mob
state.
rule.
No, not mob rule. Organized control democratically of the workers for the workers. But in your system, okay. So if let's say a capitalist was giving bribes to the courts and the police for whatever reason.
It wouldn't really be a capitalist then. He'd be
How,
more of a statist,
well,
using the power of the state as opposed to the power of the power of
okay.
persuasion.
This is a good point. This is a good point. Now, sure, he maybe by your definition he might not, but he might not. But what I'm saying is, under capitalism, your capitalism, all the incentives are there. Like every capitalist who's successful is incentivized to pay off the elements of the state that it can in order to gain an advantage somehow in the market to increase. I mean, because the whole goal of a capitalist is to increase profit, increase market share, and to crush their competition. So if they can do that by
Not by using the state, though.
no, yeah, but the incentives there. So like, why wouldn't a capitalist do that if they had the ability? If it was they saw a window open, then and they say, these cops and these courts, they're not making, they don't have a they can't afford a trip to Aruba. They can't afford a cottage in the Hamptons. What if we invite them out there? What if we give them something? And all of a sudden, they're able to do these things that they couldn't before and live the rich life by taking some bribes from me.
I think it's not in their interest to violate other people's rights. I think that's basically what you're saying, like that it would be, or that there's this incentive to violate other people's rights.
Yeah.
I don't think there is. If you're thinking long range about what's most conducive to your own well-being, including your own psychological well-being, if you treat other people badly, then I don't think you can, by violating their rights, by living as a parasite on them, I don't think you can fully respect yourself.
Under early capitalism, under free market conditions, before there was monopolies, that's what they were doing. They were treating their workers like they were working them 14 hours a week. They were hiring children because there were no laws. Workers were dying left and right in the foundries, getting crushed by machinery because they were incentivized to do so, because profit is their main incentive. And if you want freedom, it just doesn't make any sense to me why this would be the ideal system for you.
Hiring workers to work long hours and hiring children is not per se a violation of freedom.
Sure.
I mean, things get better over time. So when you're in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, you can't fault these people for being in worse conditions. I mean, they were made that we could eventually have a standard of living. It wasn't necessary for parents to send their children to work. They could afford to just send them to school and get an education. But there was a stage people didn't have wealth. They did the best they could at the time. And that could mean sending the kid to work for some amount of time. But I mean, I don't think that's being cruel. That was just the reality of the time. You have to start from a more poor condition, and then over decades, over generations, you work your way to a time where, now we have an 8-hour workday. Maybe in 100, 200 years, we'll have a 4-hour workday.
Okay, but why?
That doesn't mean we're being cruel right now by making people work 8 hours a day. It's just that's where we happen to be right now.
But why do we have an 8-hour workday? Why do we have a weekend? Why do we have vacation pay and benefits? Well, we're less now, but let's say why did we have those things in the 50s and 60s and 40s? Where did they come from? Where did
I think the better conditions come from leaving people free, and that's capitalism. So I think the progress
is that what happened.
That's through
so capitalists just
productive,
out of the kindness of their hearts just decided to pay their
out of greater productivity. In inventions, over time you get the steam engine, you got the cotton gin, you got the invention of electricity, the light bulb, the whole energy industry, oil, trains, all these things increase our standard of living. Now we've got smartphones, so life gets better and better. But for that to happen, I think you need to give people freedom, including freedom to innovate. The mind is the source of wealth. That's a big difference between Marx's view and Rand's view. Mm-hmm. She doesn't have a materialistic view of the source of the wealth. She thinks the human mind is the basic source of wealth. We had muscle power for millennia, going back to cave days, but it was in the wake of the scientific revolution, when all this knowledge was discovered, that eventually made possible the Industrial Revolution and all the technology that enabled. So now we have rocketed forward in the last few hundred years in our standard of living, thanks to the political and economic freedom that's increased over that time. So if we want more progress, I think we need more freedom.
I
But
mean, I fully agree. I fully agree. We need more freedom, but
which means absence of coercion, including coercion by the states.
so I also agree. Actually, that means an absence of coercion. But if you
But of
are
course, we don't agree on what coercion is.
so if you're a worker working, let's say we're back in the 1840s. If you're a worker working a 14-hour day, and all your other workers are working 14-hour days, well, then what you do in order to change that is say, well, you know that the boss needs you in order to make money, so make their profits, and you know that the boss is exploiting your labor time, skimming off the top. So what you do is you organize with your fellow workers and institute some coercion of your own on the boss and say, hey, you know what? We're not going to work for you. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to help you make that profit unless you shorten our workday and give us better wages. And I mean, it sounds like you don't know much of the history of, the labor history of the United States, but Marx isn't wrong when he says history is the history of class struggle. All of the things I mentioned before, vacation pay, weekends, like these didn't exist until unions were formed and fought for them individually. Like you could look up how each of these things was won, and you'll find every single time it was because unions fought for it. So, and how they do that through coercion, by fighting the boss, by putting pressure on them and saying, all right, you're going to lose market share, you're going to lose profitability because we're shutting down the factory for now, and you can't do anything about it until we agree to better conditions.
Okay.
So I would say that's how freedom is won.
So I think there are a number of myths about the history of capitalism, and I have a book by Ayn Rand, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which has a chapter called Common Fallacies About Capitalism. And one of them is about the role of labor unions. So I can read you. This is actually from another author contributing to her book, Nathaniel Branden. So here's a paragraph that he wrote. He says, it was the economic self-interest of employers that led them to raise wages and shorten working hours, not the pressure of labor unions. The 8-hour day was established in most American industries long before unions acquired any significant size or economic power. At a time when his competitors were paying their workers between $2 and $3 a day, Henry Ford offered $5 a day, thereby attracting the most efficient labor force in the country and thus raising his own production and profits. In the 1920s, when the labor movement in France and Germany was far more dominant than in the United States, the standard of living of the American worker was greatly superior. It was the consequence of economic freedom, unquote. So he's saying that it wasn't labor unions, it was the forces of capitalism that were making things better. But I know it's a common, he would say myth, that it was thanks to labor unions that things were getting better.
Yes.
There's all kinds of things like, so, I'm not an economic historian, but, he's looked into this more than I have. He cites people like
guy?
Ludwig von Mises, Austrian
he's
economist.
Notoriously bad economist.
Well, you're a socialist, right? So of course you're going to have that point of view, right?
But I mean, even in bourgeois economics, like none of them take von Mises seriously anymore. He's very.
That's not my impression. I think there's a whole school of Austrian economists that hold him in very high regard.
They hold Hayek in higher regard, and Hayek wasn't an idiot. He had some things to say. He had some, but he was a neoclassical economist, and von Mises was especially like, if you play out his equations and the way he thinks about the world, none of it really pans out. Although this is kind of a different different conversation. I don't want to get into economics too much, but what we were just saying about yeah. So I mean, this guy talking about unions not creating the 8-hour workday. I mean, you can just read the Wikipedia page for God's sakes. It's not really a disputable fact. Ayn Rand may have been cherry picking and fishing for examples that maybe don't tell the whole story. But there's no why are there no historians or economic historians that agree with this take? I mean, I don't think there's anybody that.
I don't know that there are none.
I guarantee you there are not.
So I mean, if this guy is just lying, then
yes.
Well, I'm going to need to look into this myself before I believe that.
Just Google like how the 8-hour workday. Like I'm sure you can find lots of sources. I could probably send you some stuff too, but. The weekend, all these fights, like the right to strike was illegal in most places. Like, and I asked you about the police earlier. Now, so some people argue that the police existed to they came out of slave to manage to manage slaves in the United States. Now that's not quite true. The police emerged out of the class struggle because unions were starting to get a little too powerful and a little too rowdy. And so, there's a long history of police murdering and beating up workers. And this was their main function for a long time, up until about the post-war period, up until after World War II, when you finally had this United States in this very unique position where it was the only industrial nation that wasn't destroyed by the war, and it had all its factories and capital going full steam ahead. And so it transitioned from a war economy, a very successful war economy, to a consumer economy very quickly, and created the world's first ever middle class, large middle class. And then shipped a lot of that wealth over to the other imperialist countries in Japan and Europe. But And that was what was able to sustain this, this leap in standard of living. But it was unions that were in agreement between unions and capital to kind of quiet the class struggle and get them to come to the bargaining table and saying, okay, we'll give you a certain standard of living in order for you to, stop pushing for, transformation of society.
So one thing that's not come up here is in connection with unions is the issue of force. So I think if unions are not using force, and if they're not taking advantage of the government using force,
they are using force.
Okay, well that's where I think the problem is. So
you don't think
they don't have a right to they don't have a right to force a company to deal with them or to bargain with them. I think that's wrong. And no, I don't think a capitalist is using force. If that's what you were going to ask.
Yes.
So we can talk more about that. Again, like this comes down to the fundamental issue of what does force mean or what is coercion. And again, so I think it means the absence of, it's basically unconsensual physical contact. I think that's a good, at least starting definition of what force is. Now, if someone just offers you a job, they're not doing that. They're not making unconsensual physical contact with your person or property. So they're not engaged in force. They're just making you an offer. It's an opportunity which you can accept or reject. They're not putting a gun to your head. So the threat of force is also force, and they're not using force or the threat of force against you. So
the reason the state is necessary and an integral part of capitalism is that the state is what recreates and produces the conditions for capitalism to succeed. It produces the conditions wherein workers and the unemployed are forced at threat of starvation to work for a boss.
Okay. Well,
Otherwise,
what
they would
about
not do that. Why would you? Why would you
you're
sell?
not forced by the threat of starvation. You face that in nature when you're by yourself.
Right. That's why humans are not by themselves.
But
That's why humans are social
but
beings. That's why
are
we're
you
social animals.
forced when you're by yourself on a desert islands? Are you forced?
To what?
Are you forced at all?
No, no, not on a desert island. Actually,
Okay.
that's a great. I'm glad you brought up a desert island. I'm glad you have you heard? You know what I'm about to ask?
Are you going to do the Coconut Islands
Yes. What's
thing?
your answer? What's your answer to the coconut
I,
island?
I I actually tried to. Well, I mentioned that on my third call with Sam Cedar, and I said it was vulgar, and he didn't want to hear the vulgar version, and I didn't really want to say it, but uh, I mean, I could if it's done in a indirect way, I don't mind saying it,
Sure.
like perform sexual favors. So for anyone listening who does hasn't heard of the Coconut Island example, which I guess Vosh is the one who originated it, or at least
I'm
made
not
it
sure
famous.
if it was him, but he made it famous. Yeah.
Yeah, so he says, and you can just look this up online, but he says, like, if you're on an island, or a plane crashes into an island,
Two
and
survivors.
there are two survivors, you and one other person, and you both, I guess, he wakes up before you do, and he gathers all the coconuts on the islands, and then he stockpiles them, and
So these are
then
my
you wake
property.
up.
These are my property.
Yeah, he says it's his property, and then you wake up, and he says, "Well, I'll give you some of my coconuts if you perform this sexual favor on me." Is that a coercive or a voluntary interaction? And I guess Vosh and many of his viewpoints take that to be a coercive interaction, and I guess that's supposed to show that
You don't think
you
so?
can coerce someone even if you're not engaging in unconsensual physical contact. If you just wield this power, if there's some kind of power imbalance, then you're engaging in coercion. And I don't buy that. I don't think it is coercive to make this offer.
What choice does that
Um,
person make? How is it not coercive? They don't have a choice to not do that because that coconuts are the only source of food on the island.
I think it's not coercion because the person who's collected the coconuts is not initiating force against him or his property.
Okay, so the what if let's say the coconut collector, the guy who woke up first, is a sadomasochist or a masochist, and just really enjoys violence, and he says, "I'll give you a coconut, but if I get to cut your hand off, one of your hands off."
Mm-hmm.
Now that person still needs the coconut to live. They need their hand less than they need to be able to live on that island. Let's say there's nothing else available.
Is that a coercive offer? I don't think so. I think he's still making an offer which the person can accept or reject. There's other options too, like the
But
person could
that's
just fight for the coconuts
mhm.
and try to
But that's coercion.
uh, uh,
That's coercion.
it could be, yeah, but
You
I
said
think this is a
violence is you
weird.
said violence is coercion.
Well, this is it's kind of an emergency situation. So I
So
think in
violence is okay. Violence
emergencies
is okay in an emergency.
it can be, yeah, in emergency situations. Ayn Rand has an article called "The Ethics of Emergencies," and she says, you know, things are different in such situations because it's not normal life. It's just you've got to um, like if you're starving and the only way to keep yourself alive is to steal a loaf of bread, she would say, yeah, go ahead, do it, steal the loaf of bread, try to pay you should also try to make up for it later once you get stabilized and on your feet again. Pay the person back. But if it's an emergency situation of life or death, then it's not the normal way of conducting yourself is not applicable. But what I think many socialists try to do is convert everything into an emergency situation in order to justify the use of force. But they're just it's invalid to do that. They're taking something out of context. Um,
Um,
they're treating something as an emergency, which isn't really an emergency. You're not
I
going to die if you work for minimum wage or $7 an hour. You're not going to be as rich as a lot of other people, but it's not an emergency situation which justifies the use of force.
I agree. It's not. I don't really like the term emergency. I don't think socialists operate under that assumption that this is everything is an emergency and therefore we're going to do coercion and violence. I think what they operate under is let's take Tsarist Russia, or let's take Cuba under Batista. Batista was a client of the United States. It was basically he had Cuba basically a playground for rich American capitalists. He was a very brutal dictator. The Cuban people were very extremely poor, illiterate, had no there was no democracy there, and so it wasn't that we're gonna Castro didn't get together with his revolutionary buddies and say this is an emergency. He said, well, actually, it's in all of our interest to overthrow these sons of bitches and make all of our lives better, and create. Actually, originally, he was looking for Castro was looking for a normal bourgeois democratic society, but the people pushed him, and the United States pushed him to towards socialism. So that's what ended up happening. And now you have, after the revolution, literacy. What happens? Literacy rates go way up. Life expectancy way up. Extreme poverty eliminated completely. They all get health care. There's a because he was following this kind of the Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist model. There's certainly a large element of bureaucratization, statism you would call it, and lack of certain freedoms. But there is not a single Cuban other than the capitalists who fled, who by the way were allowed to flee. There was very few people that were executed or anything at all, except for the nastiest people in the Batista regime. For literally everybody on that island, their lives were better after the socialist revolution than before.
I don't know much about Cuba.
Well, the same
I
story for everywhere else, really.
but I mean, if it was better than before, I don't know if it was, but even taking that for granted, um, I think it would be much better if it were a system that's uh, didn't coerce its own citizens, that left them free. I don't. I think yeah, it would be much better off. Much more progress would occur. Um, Fewer of them would be trying to escape. Aren't some of them trying to escape to Florida? Like risk their lives swimming through shark infested waters to get out of there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Some do. But you ever wonder why Vietnam and Cuba are kept as poor as they are? Like, what is? It's because the United States is not willing to, you know, to see what's the better system. They impose embargoes. Not only do they impose embargoes on their closest trading partner, Cuba, other than Canada, but they pressure other countries to not trade with Vietnam and Cuba. So basically, they isolate these countries. And what are you supposed to do if you're a tiny little island that was a backwards peasant society to begin with, and you're trying to industrialize, you're trying to advance, but the biggest powers around you are saying, no, you can't do that.
How about free yourself up? Stop coercing your own citizens, and then maybe we'll be willing to not embargo you and give you the benefit of trade, and then you can progress like other countries.
The people living there would argue they're a lot more free than they were under Batista.
Still not as free as they ought to be.
I mean, you could, okay, well, why are healthcare outcomes better in Cuba than they are in the United States? They're a much poor country. They're able
Are
to give
they?
everybody, yes, well, they're a much poorer country, and yeah, their
We're kind
healthcare.
of jumping around, right? I mean, first let's um I guess there's one question is are they free? And then another question is, are they prospering? Now, I think freedom and prosperity go together. The more freedom you have, the more you're going to prosper. The less freedom you have, the less you're going to prosper. The more you're going to stagnate.
Why is China doing so well then? Why is China so rich now? Why are they about to surpass the United States? They're not very free. They're very. It's a
I don't
very.
know. So I don't know much about China. But I do know that they liberalized their economy significantly in the 70s. I think after Mao and when Deng Xiaoping, was that his name? He liberalized the economy, and then they started to do much better. I think I've heard billions of people have come out of poverty in China and India as well because they have freed up their economies significantly.
They
So
but they're
that I think
still a
that would
state.
explain.
They're a state managed economy, and they're also very repressive still. They're just as repressive as they were
Hmm.
before, in terms of freedom of speech, um, even freedom of movement in that country. I would say they're just a.
Well,
Actually, I
I
think
would
they're
think they're they're better than they were under Mao, but I think
the
I've
conservative.
heard it's gotten worse in the last few years in China. Like it was Yaron Brook is someone I've listened to on this subject. He's an objectivist who's got a podcast, and he's visited China a number of times. And he used to go there and give talks. And I think it got to a point where the people who were hosting him uh, were were threatened in some way, and so now he no longer goes there to give talks. I don't think the people who were hosting him could host him anymore. I think they've cracked down more
Yeah, it's a
on
very repressive
freedoms.
society, and yet they're doing, they're about to
Well, yeah,
surpass
I
the
mean,
United
you don't
States.
collapse immediately because you become regressive to a extent. There's degrees here.
Okay,
You can still have a significant. You can still be doing a lot of things right at the same time that you're doing a lot of things wrong. Doesn't mean you won't be doing much better if you're more consistent about respecting freedom. But you're not going to collapse entirely because you're somewhat repressive.
well,
Um,
Germany. I mean, Germany's economy exploded.
I mean, I think the United States is somewhat repressive, but here we are. We're still going along, but I think we're doing much worse than we could be doing if we were less repressive.
Okay, well, I mean, again, Germany was economy was stagnating and under depression until Hitler came along, and he was that was the most repressive state of all time, and their economy boomed. So I'm saying,
Well, I don't think it's thanks to coercive policies. I mean, if Hitler's policies is what drove
it
him
was state
to
led
initiate a
capitalism.
world war, I don't think that worked out too well for Germany.
Yeah, it didn't. But the war, but the nationalizing and the state led economy is what directly helped them help their economy boom the way it did. I mean, I don't know how you argue otherwise. They did not have a free market economy there. I mean, they had privately owned businesses just like China, but they were all Hitler told them what to make.
Well, maybe that was bad for their economy and is part of what drove them to war. Ayn Rand has an essay called "The Roots of War," which I just read actually, and she talks about how statist countries need war because they drain their own citizens through their statist policies, and then they need to attack someone else, or else they're going to collapse. Whereas free countries, because their freedom allows them to be productive, they don't need war. War is inimical to their interests. They can support themselves. They can just become richer and richer. They just need to be left alone.
What's
But
an
if you're a parasitical country who your state survives on by leeching off productive people so that those people want to leave or stop producing as much, then once you run out of those victims, you need victims somewhere else to leech off of. So that will drive you to invade some other country.
what's an example of a free country?
Well, I think historically the U.S. is the best example. I mean, it's been more and less free at different times of its history, but I think the 19th century America, especially the late 19th century America, was probably the freest it's ever been, and that was the century of most peace in the world between the she points out the end of the Napoleonic War in 1908 or 1815 and the start of World War I in 1914. That was a century of relative peace. I've heard it called the Pax Britannica, when you have the greatest amount of the closest thing to capitalism that the world has seen. You know, when people are being productive, there's no need for them to engage in wars of conquest. They're producing stuff on their own.
That okay? What about the British opium wars? I think there was like some 20 million Chinese died over opium, and that was, and Britain was the heart of capitalism. How does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the opium wars, just like I don't know much about China. I mean, there are spots in my knowledge of history which I need to improve on, but um, I don't know that everything the British did was good for them. Just like with the Indians, as I was saying before, if there were cases where Indians were being peaceful, and then some other colonial power came in and initiated force against them, I would oppose that. So if that's what the British were doing, then I would oppose that. And I don't think it was in the interest of the British to do that. They might have gotten some short run economic boost from that, but in the long run, I think it's a bad policy to violate rights. It's not in their economic interest long range to violate rights.
Interesting. Not in their economic interest to violate rights. Now, okay, let's say you're. I'm not so sure about that, because if you are a capitalist, let's say today, and you're finding that the rates of profit in the United States and the West are a little low for you, and if you look at the rates of profit historically and right now, they are very low compared to where they used to be. Now, so they might, in that case, want to export capital and export production to a third world country where they can get much lower labor costs, and they can also have influence and on the governments through corruption, through coups, and end up in with very favorable conditions. So workers are basically forced into mines and third world factories under sweatshop conditions, right? We kept finding in the 90s, that was the big expose. Nike and all these companies were, these capitalist companies were using sweatshop labor, and you may say that's not coercive because these people agreed to it, but you also have to understand that, like, a lot of the times people get recruited from third world countries and get sent to other countries to do labor, and they're lied to. Their passports are taken away. This happens all the time because this is in the interest of the capitalist class to and nothing stops them. Like this is a famous thing that happened in Qatar for all the stadiums they're building for the Olympics. They would take poor people from other countries, promise them that they'd get wages and this, that, and the other, and basically end up sending them over, taking their passports away, and then they're slave labor. Now, you could say that this makes them not good capitalists. Okay, fine. But I'm saying all the incentives are there under capitalism for them to do this, and for them to build up a state apparatus that protects their interests. So, I mean, you could imagine a capitalism without a state somehow, I mean, in your head, but at every turn, the most successful and the largest capitalists are always going to want to expand that state in order to reproduce the conditions favorable to them and to their profitability.
Sweatshops.
Yeah, how do we explain
So
sweatshops?
so one thing about that is the issue of, are these people being coerced? And if they're just being made an an offer, if they're being given an opportunity, which they can accept or reject, I don't think they are being coerced. Certainly not by the company making the opportunity. Now, it might be that their own governments has been coercing them, and perhaps to such an extent that they're so poor that the best opportunity they have is the one that this foreign company offers them. But then if that's the best opportunity for them, and if it's a meager one, well, is that the fault of the company making the offer, or is it the fault of their own government, which has made their conditions so bad that getting paid $1 an hour is their best option? I think it's I would put the blame at the feet of their own government
But
for making their conditions so bad that
well,
that is their best
I just
offer.
explained to you that the imperialist countries, the United States and Britain, have I mean, this you can't even deny this that they historically like will fund and bribe and other countries and even give them loans in exchange for creating these conditions that are favorable to those Western capitalists. Like so I mean, you can say, oh, these third world governments are bad. It's their fault, but they're being paid and incentivized by the IMF, by the United States, by the UK to do this, because all of these bad incentives are there if profit is the main motive for everything.
Okay, well, I mean, if that's the case, I don't think that is a capitalist or pro freedom thing to do, and I don't think it's in the interest of these companies to do it. Not in the long range
They
interests.
seem, but they seem to think it is. They all seem to think it is, and they're all profiting very well off of how they're
Well,
doing things right now.
if I know that a company like Nike is trying to influence the Chinese government such that the Chinese government is more able to treat its own people as slaves,
Hmm.
then I'm going to have a bad view of Nike, and I'm not going to want to patronize Nike anymore. And
But that,
I
but
mean,
we found that
I'm
out
just
in the '90s, and nobody stopped buying Nikes. So what does that tell you?
well, well, I don't know that that all these conditions I just laid out are true. I don't know if it's true that Nike is trying to help, trying to enable slave labor, uh,
Who's doing it then?
and
If it's not these big capitalists going to the why are they going to the third world if not for that, right? Like what why?
maybe because it's just cheaper labor, not slave labor. But I don't know that we agree on what slave labor is, because I don't know that we yet agree on what coercion is. So this goes back to the earlier discussion, because sometimes socialists will use terms like wage slavery, things that I wouldn't call slavery. So I don't know that what you're calling slavery is the same thing that I would call slavery. So I think we have to be clear on that first.
It's actually the Republican Party in the United States was fond of calling it wage slavery for a period in the 19th century because they saw um, the exploitation of the working class, the white working class, as no better or not much better than the way blacks were being exploited in the South. And because the American Revolution, as you say, was really about Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and all these guys were their goal was to really realize the goals of the Enlightenment and create a truly emancipated society for everyone. Like they believed in equality, but what I'm saying is that the capitalist mode of production is the thing that gets in the way, is the main contradiction there. It's what prevents that freedom from being possible, and that's what Marx explains. And that's what Marx explains. That's why Marx explains, well, if you want to complete the revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and actually have this meritocratic, equal society, you have to finish it with socialism, because you can't do it. You will never create that kind of freedom and equality and opportunity. Especially opportunity is the biggest one under capitalism.
Well, at this point, I think we still have different definitions of freedom, because I think we still have different definitions of force or coercion. So to really respond to what you're saying there, I think we would have to, because you're talking about freedom and how we're implementing. The founders had this vision of freedom, and to complete their vision of freedom, we need socialism, according to Marx. I mean, to have this discussion, that's presupposing we already agree on what this term freedom means, but I don't think we're there yet. So, so we can go to that issue, but I think it has to be addressed on that level. I can't just respond
Well,
to.
I mean, if you okay, what I'm saying is you have an idea of what freedom is from Ayn Rand
and what force is.
And I'm saying those are you cannot the type of society that would produce is not a very nice one. It's not one that will really meaningfully produce freedom for anyone. Like if by your definition a homeless person on the street with mental health issues and psychosis is free, well then really everybody can live in destitution under your system and be free. And you know, the Marxist definition of freedom, which is freedom from abstract domination, freedom from coerced labor, which is what capitalism is. So labor.
So you're using the term coercion there.
Yeah, yeah.
But we have different definitions of coercion, so we're going to have to talk about that.
So okay, so I'll define it. That you need to do in order to reproduce yourself, to survive. So let's say an aristocrat from the 1300s, 1400s, that person is free because that person does not have to toil in the fields. They have their own serfs to do that. That person doesn't cook for themselves. They own. They're an owning class. They have they control the surplus generated from society, or generated at least from their own fiefdom. They control it themselves, and therefore they are able to be free to, let's say, become a philosopher, become a scientist, or just lay around the house and play golf. That person is free because they're able to be self-directed in their own labor. They are not coerced by the need to survive, the need to eat, by working for someone else.
Can you define coercion for me?
Coercion would be the opposite of the freedom I just described. So being coerced by either a system or some. Yeah, it would be a system in this case, but it's also unfree to be a hunter gatherer and having to spend every waking moment of your life moving around doing work that reproduces that allows you to reproduce your day-to-day life. Like you need to work 12 hours a day in order to just survive. That's unfreedom, and you could say that's coercion if you like.
So you've defined freedom in terms of coercion when you said like you're free when you're not being coerced. So you can't then you can't then define coercion in terms of freedom. That would be circular. So I want to know what coercion is in a non-circular way. So can you define coercion without making reference to freedom?
Having to labor for your own survival, basically, or because someone is having to labor in order to survive, and that can be either because you are out in the woods and you've chosen to be out in the woods and you need to collect berries all day to survive, or because you are a serf working under a master, a lord, or if you're a worker who can't survive without the income that the boss gives you.
All right. So if coercion means having to labor in order to survive, then you're coerced even if there's no one else around, even if you're on an island by yourself.
This is not.
So you got to labor in order to survive.
Yeah.
So you're coerced.
But if we live in a society where you do not have to, if the means of production are developed enough where nobody has to work, which our current society is that way, then toiling 12 hours a day for your own survival is a form of coercion when the productive capabilities of that society are already such that you could be easily living a life where you didn't have to do any work for to reproduce yourself.
Okay, so you're using coercion in a way that's different than the way
Because
I use it.
Marxists don't use the
So
word coercion really. I'm just trying to fit it into your. I'm trying to fit it into your schema.
okay, but I mean, we're going to be talking past each other as long as we don't have the same definition of coercion, because which we don't have. So because your definition of coercion allows that someone could be coerced even when he is alone, mine doesn't.
They're coerced by the
Mine
need to survive.
requires,
They are
yeah.
coerced by.
That's not coercion on the way I understand it. So we've kind of hit uh,
Right, but we do
uh,
not. None of us
a
live in this.
point where we're talking different languages in this respect. So we have to be talking the same language to continue here. So we can discuss, what is coercion, or we can debate that whether you have the right understanding of coercion or whether I have it or whether neither of us have it. But that's what we have to debate at this
Look,
point.
okay, so the reason I said it that way is because I wanted a historically a definition that would work, through all time for human history. Now, in our context, that coercion really only means that in order to reproduce yourself, you do have to sell yourself to a capitalist because someone owns all of the land. All of the land is spoken for. You cannot just be born one day and find a plot of land and start growing your own food. You cannot do that. Everything is already swallowed up. It's privately owned. So you are in fact coerced in our current context.
Well, if we don't agree about the island context, I mean, I think we should start with that because that's the simpler case. If we don't agree on that, we're not going to agree on anything else. So if you think someone is coerced alone on an island and I don't, then we've already got incompatible understandings of coercion.
If there's two people on an island and one person takes all the coconuts, then there is coercion. If there's one person alone on the island, then coercion is not okay. Well, I'll give you that. Coercion is not the right word for their situation, especially because they don't have an option of being in a society at that point. They're only alone. So you can forget that one.
Okay, so then coercion is not simply having to labor to survive. So we're throwing that definition out.
Well, it's having to labor, being forced to work. Yeah, it's still being forced to work by a system. Let's say by a
You're
system.
using the term force. That's a synonym of coercion.
You're being coerced to
forced.
You're being coerced to work for your own survival. Where in a system where the productive capacities do not necessitate that. You could live in a way that where you don't have to work to survive. You could have self-directed work, but we don't.
I'm trying to understand what your definition of coercion is. So you just use coercion in a sentence, but I'm trying to get beneath that and understand what do you mean by coercion, right? You can't explain coercion in terms of itself. So you had offered before this definition of coercion as having to labor to survive. And I said, no, that's now off the table based on what you just said, that if you're alone on an island, you're not coerced there. So then you need to have some other definition of coercion if you're going to still use that term.
I already talked about how it applies to capitalism and why capitalism is coercive.
I just want to know your new definition, if you have one. I mean, I don't expect you to come up with one on the spot. I mean, it's a pretty significant change, I think. If you're abandoning,
Marxists don't think about it in terms of coercion. They think about it in terms of freedom, and your freedom changes by degrees throughout history. We have based on the development of the means of production and the degree to which you must uh, work in order to reproduce your life activity, your and as opposed to being free, like that aristocrat I was talking about, to do self-directed work, right? That aristocrat is free. The worker, the serf working for him, is unfree.
I don't think we can talk about freedom apart from talking about coercion, because at least I can't, because I understand
Right, but that's
freedom in terms of coercion. So if you have this other Marxist way of understanding freedom, which makes no reference to coercion, then we're talking different languages again.
but then my point earlier was that your version of freedom and coercion, or at least that dichotomy in your definition of freedom, does not help you create a better society, whereas mine does explicitly.
Well, we can't have that discussion because you and I mean different things by freedom and coercion.
Right, and I'm
So if you
saying
mean
your
different things by X, and you're saying X X promotes prosperity, and you think X doesn't promote prosperity, or the reverse, we're still talking about different things because we don't mean the same thing by X.
but I'm saying, I'm even by your definition, I'm saying it doesn't, like it. You don't have a better society. You just have more. You just have people not literally putting hands on you. A society where where you can't eat, or you don't have the freedom to travel the world, or um, uh, you know study at school, is not. I don't understand how you think that's better in any way than a
Well,
society.
I think the opportunities are much better in the society that runs on the abolition of force, as I understand force. I think there's tremendous progress. I think America has become the richest country in the world, and millions of immigrants from around the world have tried to come here because of the freedom that this country has,
Or is it because of the
because of the
wealth the
absence
country
of
has,
force.
and because of the rights that the unions have won, the
I
working
mean, they
rights?
were coming here in the 19th century when
Because there
they
was free
were
land. They were inviting them
they
over.
were
They needed to populate the land that they were kicking the Indians off.
I think they were coming here significantly because of freedom, the absence of force, in other words, as I understand force. And that absence of force is what's enabled this country to become so rich. The freedom to innovate, to use your minds, to keep the results of your own efforts.
To keep the result. Okay, that's it. To keep the results of your own efforts, but that isn't what happens in a in a as a wage laborer, right? Let's like
Now you're going to go into Marxist surplus value
well, like
stuff,
if
right?
you're a renter, right? If you're born rich, and you can own, and you're able to buy things, buy houses and rent to people, and someone's born dirt poor, and all of the income they have has to be spent on rent because they're not able to save enough to buy a house. How does that equal any kind of freedom, and even on your definition?
How does having to spend all your money on rent equal amount to freedom? Is that the question?
Yeah, if you're working for someone else, your wages are going to be necessarily so low that you can't buy a house on your as a factory worker in the 19th century. And let's say you haven't had unions yet, so your wages are necessarily lower.
I mean, you don't have a right to a certain standard of living. You have a right to not be forced, on my understanding of force. And when a country is starting out, then the standard of living is necessarily going to be low. But I think it's going to increase to the greatest possible extent if you do leave people free from force, as I understand it, and that will allow the standard of living to rise. If you coercively take away what people have earned through taxes, they will have less incentive to work. I certainly will have less incentive to work if I know that half of my income is going to be taken away by the states. I'm not going to want to work as much. I want to support my own life. That's why I'm working to make my own life better.
Why has you mentioned that prosperity helps raise everybody's standard of living, right? Like it's
Freedom helps raise everyone's standard of living, as I understand freedom. Freedom is what correlates with prosperity. It leads to prosperity.
okay. So then, but if you okay, so then prosperity therefore should be an indicator of freedom, should it not? If you're a very
Yeah,
prosperous nation, okay.
yeah,
So then
and I think it is.
then you are you why okay well you are you the United States and China both the most free by your equation, are they the most free places on earth then?
I think U.S. is significantly more free.
But their economy is slowing a lot faster and China's gaining on them.
Um, Maybe so. I mean, I think U.S. has lost a lot of freedom over the 20th century. I think our freedom, as I've said before, was at its peak in the 19th century, and it's been eroding with the growth of the state, FDR's New Deal, the Great Society, so-called Great Society, which I think has made it a worse society. The progressive movements, all the regulations. I think all that has been bad for America and has slowed us down. And meanwhile, other countries, I think, have become more free in some respects, or at least freer than they were. And that's allowed them to catch up. Maybe it'll allow them to surpass the United States. And good for them if they can do it. I don't think it's a race. I think every country should be maximally free. And it's in every country's interest for every other country to be maximally free.
Did the Trump tax cuts and the George Bush tax cuts, did they increase freedom?
I would think so. I don't know much about those, but sure, yeah, letting people keep more of their wealth is a way of increasing freedom. I think a lot more is necessary, like cutting spending. I think if you just reduce government revenues by cutting taxes, but you still have all the same spending programs in the place, then you still have to pay for them somehow, maybe through inflation or borrowing. But that's just another way of taking people's wealth in a more stealthy way than taxation, actually.
How would eliminating Medicare or Medicaid how would that increase freedom for people?
It would give them the ability to choose how they spend their own money. So instead of having part of your paycheck automatically deducted for Medicare.
But this is for retired people.
Medicare. Yeah, and you have to pay in through all your working years. Part of your paycheck is automatically taken out to go to Medicare, but you should be free to do whatever you want with your full paycheck. It shouldn't be coercively taken away from you. So it would increase your freedom by giving you the opportunity to do whatever you want to do. Maybe invest it in the market, maybe invest it in healthcare, just as it is now. But it should be your choice to do with it as you please.
Okay, so that's the market. You brought up the market. Crypto is a lot of libertarians and objectivists love crypto. They love Bitcoin. It's deflationary currency. It's the opposite of the Federal Reserve. It's not, they can't just print money, and it's also full of scams, as we've been witnessing. Lots of rug pulls. Now, is it good that people are being conned into investing in these rug pulls and losing all their money because they had the choice to do that? They believed in it. It was a lot of libertarian type people talking about all the good aspects of a lot of these coins and these NFT scams, and lots of people have lost their livelihoods already, and it's only the beginning of the crash. One might argue that government regulation on the cryptocurrency market could have prevented this, but under your definition of freedom, it's a good thing that people made a decision with their own free, rational decision making and came to the conclusion that they should put all their money in Luna coin or whatever it was, and then lost their life savings.
Well, I don't say it was a good decision if they did that, but I think it should be a free decision. So I know very little about Bitcoin, but what I can say is I think people should be free to invest their money as they choose. They shouldn't be forcibly stopped from doing that. But I also think fraud, people shouldn't be able to engage in scams and frauds, but there's already laws on the books to prevent fraud. That's not something that's
So
consistent with
so what
a
does that tell you though?
capitalist society.
Like there's laws in the books to prevent fraud, and yet it happens anyway.
I mean, there's always going to be fraudsters, just like there's always going to be people who try to bribe. But I think what
Not
you try to
necessarily.
do with
Not in a
this,
social
or
society.
what you should try to do is come up with a system that minimizes such things. And I don't think the way to deal with that is to legalize it and say bribery is okay or coercing people is okay. I think you should make it against the law, and then people have to revert to being covert and secretive and breaking the law, so that they are put at war with reality, and they're always under threat of exposure, under the threat of scandal, under the threat of blackmail. When this comes out into the light, which I think will happen eventually, the way to do it is to illegalize it, not to legalize it, and that's what minimizes it. But there's always going to be people who are acting irrationally and try to get away with stuff.
How so you mentioned you mentioned the courts, you mentioned the police and the military. Now, who's coming up with the laws though? Do you not have to have some sort of legislative body to
Yeah,
make these laws?
yeah. Those are just the main three. I think they're courts, military, and police. But yeah, I think you need a legislature. Um, Maybe something else.
So
I don't
government.
know. Yeah, but just to keep it simple, I think I usually just mention those three. But there might be some other things like a legislature, but not like an entire Department of Education or Social Security bureaucracy or Medicare bureaucracy. All that is going to be gone. Um,
Okay, well, okay. Now, but what if? Okay, so if you have a military and
or
you're
regulatory agencies, all those alphabet agencies, all those are going to be gone too. Sorry, go ahead.
um right, but so a military and police they require like to have an effective military. You need you need engineers, you need people who understand math and physics and lots of basics, geography even. If you need people, you're gonna get people to plan invasions and plan defenses and understand topography and this, that, and the other. There's a lot of education involved. So, um, what if let's say you're in a world that requires a military in the first place, that means you probably have enemies, and therefore it's in your would it not be in your interest as the state to have an education system that will that will create competent soldiers. Now, are you going to leave that up to chance? Because every country in the world was doing that, and then they said, well, actually, we need competent soldiers, so they created, a mass education, a public education system.
I don't think you need a public education system to get competent soldiers. You need people to be educated, but that doesn't mean forcing some people to pay for other people's education. Because it's in the nation's interest to have a military, and
Is it not to have educated people? Is it not?
no, sure it is, but it's in people's interest to have shoes. But that doesn't mean you need to start forcing people to pay for other people's shoes.
Well, it seems like every state in the world, which at one point had, had capitalists, had commodity production, decided that it was in their best interest to have public education. So I'm wondering, why do you think that happened?
Well, I don't. I haven't looked at. I know the founders, at least some of them. I think Jefferson thought it was good to have some public education, at least at the university level. He started the University of Virginia, where I actually went for my undergraduate. But I think that's evidence that the founders didn't have a perfect understanding of rights. I don't think John Locke had a perfect understanding of rights. I mean, he thought rights still derive from God, and even in the Declaration, the founders say that men are endowed by their Creator with these rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they had this religious view, which I think is totally wrong. I think there's a secular source of rights, which Ayn Rand identified. And if they had understood the secular nature of rights and understood rights better than they did, I don't think they would have advocated public education, which I think has been a disaster, by the way. I mean, you have kids graduating high school these days, who I think are terribly educated. Some of them can't read and write, or they have a very low level, far below their grade level of reading and writing, can't do math. I used to tutor kids in middle school, seventh, eighth graders who could still not read, some of them, who still couldn't do basic arithmetic, some of them. So I think the public education system has been a disaster, and it would be much better if it were privatized and there was the incentive of competition to put out a good product. So that's another big subject unto itself. But I don't think I mean, you can say, yeah, it's good to have an educated public in order to have a thriving, flourishing society, and but I don't think it's valid to leap from that to therefore it's right to force people to pay for other people's education. And maybe the founders just didn't recognize that part of it. Just they weren't right about slavery. So they were wrong about that, and that had to be fixed.
Well, I mean, to be fair to some of the founders, the left wing of the radical wing of the revolution they did acknowledge that slavery was an evil that needed to be overcome. They just realized they weren't going to be able to do it at this early stage, because the southern founding fathers and the colonies were not willing to give it up at that early stage, and they kind of actually predicted that the Civil War would end up having to happen. But sorry, that's kind of
yeah. Some of them had a better view on slavery than others did. I don't know all the details about the various founders and what their views were, but yeah, I know for some of them it was a compromise, and they thought, this is the best we can get at this point. But yeah, it wasn't going to last.
Okay. Okay. I mean,
your signal was gone, by the way, or your video.
My camera's overheated, so it's kind of hot in my room. I should probably turn the AC on, but the AC is really loud, so it would kind of ruin the sound. But
I didn't hear anything. I don't know if you had it on before. But.
No, I didn't. But when I have it on, it's pretty loud. It's pretty close. But I mean, we're about 2.5 hours, so I think we should probably wrap up.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, so like from my perspective, like the libertarian view of things is like purely, it's idealist, right? I don't think it understands where the material roots of the things it's talking about came from, and how capitalism emerges, why it emerges, and what its contradictions are, what its direction is. That's a really important one too. Like capitalism, if you give the perfect conditions to a capitalist society, let's say we make an island with libertarian fantasy island or objectivist fantasy island, my argument is that Marx shows in Capital why capitalism ends up being exactly what it is now, and why actually what we have now is capitalism. It's just the natural progression of a free market, unregulated capitalism to what we have now, and that the state is inextricably tied with it. You can't have capitalism without a state enforcing and reproducing that mode of production, and that the libertarian idea is something kind of dreamed up on paper, right? It's abstract, it's idealist, it's a lot like the neoclassical economists, von Mises and Hayek. Their version of their drawing of abstract equations and stuff that never ended up really panning out in the real world. But this is Ayn Rand, in her defense, like she was living under Stalinism, which was a very brutal system that I would never advocate for. But so I think she took an extremist position to counter that, and I think I mean, even Jordan Peterson doesn't really see her philosophy as a strong point, and this idea of splitting the world into coercion and freedom and non-aggression principles, and the idea that we can like make a society around kind of a culture of values, doesn't make sense to me, because culture is a product of the society, the way society is organized, not the other way around. You do not have a bunch of ideas and then produce a society and a production out of that. You have you have material contradictions in society, and a material base for how society is organized, and the ideas come out of it. And you justifying ideas like the Protestant work ethic, for example, and socialism, again, to really achieve freedom for me, is freedom from work, is freedom to live life, a self-directed life. That's what makes humans humans. Humans are able to do self-directed labor, but under a capitalist society, that's extremely limited. Most of the work we're forced to do is for the benefit of others, and it's not self-directed. It's we need to do it to survive. We're not choosing what we want to learn, what we want to do in our day-to-day lives, at the end of the day. And I think it's a lie. You're lying to yourself if if you think working some job at in either the government or for Walmart or Amazon is a true choice. I think that's a delusion. And socialism is the only means to actually achieve that, a true freedom, a more substantial freedom. I mean, the freedom you're talking about is a type of freedom. I just think it's a very surface level and insubstantial freedom, and that you'd be better off thinking about freedom in a deeper way, in a more material way. And I will let you have the final word.
Okay. Well, thank you again for having me on here. I will close my closing statement here. I think I'll be shorter. I'll just say, I do not believe we have capitalism today. Far from it. So I think it's a straw man to blame or to point to today's system as capitalism, and say, whatever problems we have today, look at how badly capitalism is doing. I think that's a straw man sort of approach. The way I understand capitalism, the way Ayn Rand understands capitalism, means people are not subject to the initiation of force, physical force, and the closest we had to that was probably in the late 19th century in the United States. The only proper functions of governments are a military, police, and courts, and maybe in a legislature, but that's basically it. So there's a massive amount of things the government is doing today that it wouldn't be doing in the system I envision following Rand's. All the taxes, all the regulations we have had that's been growing for over a century, from the progressives to the New Deal era to the Great Society, so-called greats. I think all these things were moves away from genuine freedom, which I understand to be the absence of the initiation of physical force. I think this system is an ideal and is also practical, and that the historical record bears it out. I think the closer a society has come to this ideal, the better it's done, the more it's prospered, the reason why millions of people have tried to flock to the shores of this country. So I think it is a practical ideal, and it's got tons of historical evidence to bear it out, and that I think we could do even better if we had more of it, if we were even more consistent in our respect for freedom. Unfortunately, I think we're becoming less consistent. The state should exist. I'm not an anarchist, but it should have a much more restricted role, restricted to the protection of individual rights, which means protecting people from force, which means protecting people from unconsensual physical contact. I think that is what force is, and that's a proper understanding of it. And I think that's one of the root disagreements that came up in this discussion of what exactly force is. So I'm glad that that came up because I think it exposed one of the key fundamentals of political philosophy. And I invite anyone to read this book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand, to learn more about my perspective. And also, again, my YouTube channel, there's a lot there on ethics as well as politics, youtube.com/Dan Norton 1. So thank you again for having me on. I appreciate it.
You are welcome. Thanks for coming. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, chat, for hanging out. And we are done.